Hashem. Today's Daf Yomi is Chullin Lamed Beis, but we're going to start on the bottom of Lamed Aleph Lamed Beis, the bottom line. We've been discussing yesterday a dispute between Rabbi Nosson and the Rabbanan on whether or not Shechita requires intent. Rabbi Nosson says Shechita does not require intent, and the Rabbanan say it does. So the Gemara connects this to a dispute about a para aduma, to a halacha about a para aduma, a red heifer, that the general halacha is that if you're involved in doing another malacha while you do anything with the red heifer, that will disqualify the para aduma. So now it says Rava on the bottom of Lamed Aleph Lamed Beis, I'm a Rava shacha para. Let's say you were slaughtering the red heifer, behema acheres ima, and then you decided to do two shlitos at the same time. Well, we've already said that two shlitos can be done at the same time. So therefore, with divrei hakol psula, according to everybody, this is going to be a disqualified red heifer because you did another melacha with it. So the animal will be kosher because it's a valid shlita, but the paradum will be disqualified. But let's say nishchata behema acheres ima. Let's say you didn't intend to slaughter the other animal; it just happened. And no intent, like you slaughtered it, and then the animal, a second animal just came through running up. It liked the knife so much it stuck its neck in front. Then Rabbi Nosson, para psula, according to Rabbi Nosson, the red heifer is disqualified and the behema is kashera, but the animal is kosher because, according to Rabbi Nosson, shlita does not require intent. And so therefore, since it doesn't require intent, it'll be kosher shechita on the second animal. And so too, the red heifer will be disqualified because the red heifer, because another malacha was done with it, another activity. And so therefore, the red heifer is disqualified. But according to the Rabbanan, who require intent, so therefore, para kasher, the red heifer will be kosher because the second animal was not a proper shechita, but the behema will be psula, but the animal will be disqualified because you require intent. The Gemara says, but all this is obvious. Pshita, this is so obvious. Why do you need to tell us this implications of their law? So the Gemara says, we need it to be taught, Nishlata behema acheres Rabbi Nosson it's tzichalei. We need to focus on this idea that if the other animal was slaughtered without intent, that in this case, Rabbi Nosson would say it's disqualified, and that it's kosher, and the paraduma is disqualified. Because you might have thought v'shachar osa marachmana, lo osa v'chaverta. So you might have thought that since the pasuk says about the para aduma, since it says lo osa v'chaverta, so it says that you slaughter an animal, but it means you're not allowed to slaughter an animal and its friend. And hechidami could go in. When does this case apply that you're not allowed to slaughter another animal and its friend? That will disqualify it. When do we say that there's a disqualification to slaughter an animal and its friend? When you slaughter, about the red heifer, when you slaughter two red heifers together, but if you slaughter the chulin animal, I might have thought it's not disqualified. So we see from here that it's disqualified even if you slaughter another animal with it, and that's what that's what the chiddush of Rava is in Rabbi Nosson's law. So you would slaughter two red heifers together. Now, for many years, when they were reading this Gemara, they said, "Oh, this is ridiculous. How are you going to slaughter two red heifers together? What are you worried about? There's only been 9 in history." Then all of a sudden, you get to 10th and 11th at the exact same time. You decide to slaughter them. But as I said here, in Israel I visited, and there were 3 red heifers together in Shiloh. So it's certainly possible nowadays. So then the next line, let's say cut a piece of squash with with the red heifer. Divrei hakol psula. Everybody would say that the red heifer is disqualified because you you did another malacha while you were doing the red heifer. But let's say it was cut without intent, then divrei hakol kshera. Then it's kosher because you did not intend to cut the gourd, and so therefore the paraduma is kosher. Okay, now we're up to the Mishnah. Nafla sakin v'higbia. Let's say the knife fell from you and you lifted it up, or nafu kelav, or your clothing fell v'higbiyan, and you lifted them up. Hishlas as hasakin. Let's say what you did was you sharpened the blade before the shlita, va'afba, and then he got tired in the middle of the shlita, and ba'chaver v'shachat, and his friend came along and finished the shlita. In all these cases, imshah kedei Shchita psua. If you paused, shah is to pause. If you pause the amount of time it would take to do a shlita, then your shlita is disqualified. This is one of the 5 psulei shlita. They are shia, drasa, chalada, gramaik, one of them is shia, pausing. So if you pause the time it takes to do a shlita, it's disqualified. Or Rabbi Shimon Omer Mshah Kedei Bikor. If you pause the time it takes to do an inspection, it's disqualified. So let's see what this means. My kedei shlita. What does it mean that you did? Hold on a second. What does it mean you pause the time it takes to do shlita? My kedei shlita. Amarav kedei shlitas behema acheres. The time it takes to do another animal. So if you pause the time it takes to do another animal, then the shlita is disqualified. So the Gemara says, Amrile Rav Kahana Rav Asi Rav. Does that mean Kidei Shchitas Behema or Behema Va'of? Does it mean the time it takes for if you're doing an animal, you pause the time it takes to slaughter another animal, and if you're doing a fowl, the time it takes to slaughter another fowl. Odelmar maybe means Af Behema Va'of, that even if you're doing a fowl, we're going to give you, before you're disqualified for pausing, the time it takes you to do an animal, which is more time. So that's more lenient. Amalahu. So this is the question that Rav Kahana and Rav Asi asked to their Rebbe Rav. So Rav says, interesting line, he says, Lo ave b'dichna b'chabibi d'shayli. So Rav says, I wasn't in a Rav's uncle was Rabbi Chia. Rabbi Chia was his uncle because Rabbi Chia, Rav's parents were Rabbi Chia's brother and sister. They weren't related. They were Rabbi Chia's half brother and married his half sister. So neither one of them was related. So they were Rav's parents, and they married each other. And they were Rav's parents. And Rav studied the laws of Shlita with Rabbi Chia, but he says, but this day, I wasn't in a good place with him. I wasn't in a good place with him to ask him this question. This is shyly. So what's the answer? So Rav says each one is more stringent. A fowl only has the time it takes to slaughter a fowl and an animal. Where Shmuel says Shmuel says an oath even at the time it takes to slaughter an animal before being slaughtered. So like Shmuel. Rabbi Chanina gives even more time. What's pausing? Time it takes to bring another animal and slaughter it. The Avi Gemara says, "Afil me'alma." You mean to say you bring it from wherever it is? Now it's all subjective. It says I'm bringing an animal from California. Then you have 6-hour flight to pause. So the Gemara says no. That's obviously not what it means. So no, the distinction between them is we're talking about a case where the animal, do you count the time it takes to throw the animal down or just the slaughter? Meaning before they would slaughter the animal, they would throw it on the ground like a rodeo in order to shecht it. So the question is that amount of time also included? So Rabbi Chanina says that it is included, but Rav and Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan say it's not. Amri b'ma'arava mishmein Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Chanina kadeshi agbiena v'yarbitzena. Then time it takes to pick it up and then also put it back down. You pick it up and put it down, and that's what we're talking about. V'yishlot daka l'daka v'gas l'gasa, and the sheep for the sheep, and like a gas is a big animal for a big animal. Amarava shochet b'sakin ra. Here a sakin ra is like a butter knife, a dull knife, not a sharp knife. Let's say you slaughter with a sakin raw, feel kol yom kuak share. Even if you're slaughtering the whole day, you're cutting back and forth. That's not called pausing because you're involved in the action. So now the Gemara asks the question in this context, by Rava Sheyus Mao Starfu. The different pauses throughout the day, do they combine to make the one amount of time it takes to pause? So the Gemara says, well, why don't we learn it out from what Rava himself taught? That you could pause the whole day long by slaughtering, and then it's going to be kosher. So we see from here, so as Rashi says, Rava himself said you could slaughter with a dull knife. So we see it's not able to combine, because if it was able to combine, because the Gemara's assumption is that even if you paused in between, you're not able to go back and forth straight all day. So even if you paused at certain points, we're not going to combine them, even though you had small pauses in between. So why don't we just answer Rava's question from Rava's own teaching, where it says no, that there Hasam Medul is shy. So there, Rava was saying where you didn't actually pause at all. So you can't bring a proof. By Rav Huna, Breda Rav Natsa, and Shab, and Miut, Siman, and Mahu. So now we have this question. We've had it by Agrama, we've had it by Chalada, now we have it by Shehiyah. Let's say you pause on the minority of the Simanim. And we said here, Rashi's explanation of this line is that you pause after you slaughter the majority of the Shlita, then you pause. So what's going to be the law under this case? And the Gemara says take. Tosa says on the first clause. She on the first clause. Anyway, we okay. So we'll read the Rashi. What do we say in this case? Me, I'm reading. Do we say Kivin Avale Ruba? Since he did the majority, it's kosher. Or Dilma, do we say perhaps Kivin the Hadar Gamra Kuach Shliti? Or do we say since he goes in and completes it, it's all one Shlita, and therefore we rule stringently because it's Teku. But by the first, the B'mir Kama, if it would be the Kanet, he didn't do anything, and if it would be the esophagus, it would be disqualified. So therefore, Rashi writes as follows: Venira, it seems to me, Rashi says, let's say you slaughtered the majority of the simanim, and then you threw the bird down, and the bird is waiting to die. You're not to go back and cut up the remaining minority under the rubric of shlita. The mutav sheyakal atzaver, better to hit it over the neck with a knife or wait until it dies. Don't go back and put it out of its misery by continuing the shlita. Rabbi Shimon says, Nimshah kadei bikur, and then it's disqualified. If you pause the amount of time it takes to do bikur, what is kadei bikur? My kadei bikur, and Rabbi Yochanan kadei bikar shal chacham, waiting for the chacham to come and check it. Imkena, that is varachal ashirim. Well, then it's also subjective. Who knows where the chacham is? No, the time it takes for if the butcher himself is an expert, how long does it take him to check his knife? And that's how long Shehiyah is. So what's the reason why Shehiyah is prohibited? So different theories. First of all, it's halachah moshe misinai. It's just the law. But some say because if you pause, the animal died, and so then the animal will die not from shlita, but it'll die from the incomplete shlita. So that's one of the theories. Shachar esaveshet. Let's say you slaughter the esophagus. Upasak esagageres, and you yanked out the trachea. Rashi says hainu ikor. This is the prohibition of the psul shlita of called ikor. You're yanking it out, and by an animal we're talking about, not a fowl. Shachar esaveshet upasak esagageres. Oh, pasak esagageres, or you yanked out the trachea. And then you slaughter the esophagus. Oh, so you did one of them and waited for it to die. Oh, or you did chalada. You burrowed it under one of the knife and then you cut up one. So now we have Rabbi Yeshivav. Rabbi Yeshivav is one of the Asar Harugim. It's one of the 10 martyrs. He says it's in nevela. He says if it happened that disqualifying act in the middle of the shlita, it's going to be a carcass. Whereas Rabbi Kiva Omer treifa. Rabbi Kiva says a psul shlita is a treifa. And the difference between nevela and treifa is the nevela transmits tuma and a treifa doesn't. So Klal Amar Rabbi Yeshivav Mishum Rabbi Yeshua. So Rabbi Yeshivav said a teaching in the name of Rabbi Yeshua. Kol shenifsala b'shlitasa nevela. Anything that became a carcass, anything that became disqualified in the middle of the shlita is called a carcass. Kosha shlita nevela. Kosha shlitasa karoi. But let's say you slaughtered it properly. V'davar achar garam while pasul. An external factor caused it to be disqualified. Treifa, that's a treifa. V'hodu Rabbi Akiva. When Rabbi Akiva heard this, he admitted the teaching. Now, Rashi says here, this is the name Yeshivav is a shem chacham is the name of a chacham, and that's how it says in Divrei Yamim Gabe Mishmarot, where it's listed by the watches, and so therefore we know there it said Yeshivav, Rabbi Yeshivav. So sometimes in the Machzor you'll see Rabbi Yeshaviv. So no, we see exactly from here Rashi tells us how to pronounce the name Yeshivav. Okay, so Shachat Ataveshet. So Rabbi Akiva admitted to him that it's in the nevela and not a treifa if there's a disqualification that happens in the middle of the shlita. Vahodo Rabbi Akiva. So ask the Gemara, Viramini, is this really the case? We have a contradictory source, and that is our Mishnah Membeis. It says Elu Treifos Bebeima in the next chapter of our tractate is called Elu Treifos, where we list all the disqualifying things on an animal called treifos. And it says these are the treifos. It says there that that the piercing of the veshet is a treifa and not a nevela. And so since Rabbi Akiva says that if you are going to make a pierce in the veshet, there the Mishnah says it's called a treifa. But our Mishnah here says Rabbi Akiva changed his mind and says it's a nevela. So who is the author of the Mishnah on Membeis? So the Gemara says, Amar Rava Lokasha Kancha Shachat. They're talking about, so first answer. Rava says, not a problem. Kancha Shachat Obasov Pasak, Kancha Pasak Obasov Shachat. The Mishnah over here is talking about where first you broke it, you yanked it out, and then you slaughtered it. And the Mishnah in Membeis is talking about where you did the shlita and then you did the yanking out. Shachar or besov pasak nifsalas b'shlita. Excuse me, just the opposite. The Mishnah over here is talking about a case where you did the shlita and then you yanked it out. So that's called the disqualifying act within the shlita, and that's going to be, according to Rabbi Akiva, nevela. Pasak or besov shachat, but where you first yanked it out and then did do the shlita, kidavar achar garmla, we pasul damya. So then it's like it happened beforehand, an external action, and so therefore it's going to be a treifa. Something else did it. Ravacha bar Huna challenges Rava's answer because shachat as haveshet or pasak as gargaris. Our Mishnah says if you slaughter the veshet and then you yanked it out, or pasak as gargaris, or you yanked it out and then slaughtered it, nevela. In both cases, it's in nevela, even if you did the yanking out of the trachea first. So it's a question on Rava's explanation. So the Gemara says, well, we could explain that our Mishnah here means ema v'kvar shacharas havesha meikar, that you already had slaughtered the esophagus when you pulled out the trachea. No way, says Ravacha bar Huna or Rava. He says, no way, shtei tshuvos b'davar. Two problems with that answer. One, chadadainu kamai. So, well, that's the exact same case of first slaughtering the esophagus and then yanking it out. Doesn't matter. He basically repeated the case. And also, v'od hatanan v'achar. It says, and then after you did the pasak hasagageres v'achar shachadas haveshet. So it's completely said it explicitly. Ela marava. What is this? Elu asuros katani. Rava says this refers to. Rava says that the Mishnah Membeis does not say Elu treif. These are the prohibited these are the prohibitions. These are where an animal is prohibited, and some of them are nevela, and some of them are treifa. Yeshua nevela, so Yeshua treifa. Marcel, if that's the case, since we're saying the Mishnah Membeis is not only listing treifas, it's also listing nevelos. Why don't we also list the teaching of Chizkiah? The Amar Chizkiah asa gistera. Chizkiah says if you chop the animal in half, it's a nevela. And Lichshov Nami de Rebbe Lazar. Why don't we also list the case of Rebbe Lazar? Dama Rebbe Lazar, not to Yarach B'chal Shalom Nevela, that if you ripped out its thigh or its one of its extremities, it's going to be a nevela. So, but our Mishnah doesn't list those things. The Mishnah Membeis only lists the treifos. So the Gemara says, well, Rava would have to say, Kikotani nevela, delomatame mechayim. When it lists those nevelos, it lists those nevelos that don't transmit to tumah while it's still alive. Of nevela dematame mechayim lo katani. But those nevelos that transmit to tumah while it's still alive, those it didn't list, and that's the gistera, or it's missing its like thigh. Reish Lakish Amar gives a different explanation of how we deal with the contradiction between the two Mishnayos. In our, again, what's the contradiction? Here, Rabbi Akiva is saying that a psul shlita is in a vela, and the Mishnah Membeis says elu treifos, which accounts the yanking out of the trachea and the puncturing of the esophagus. So Reish Lakish gives a different explanation. He says, "Kan sheshacha b'makom chatach, kan sheshacha shelo b'makom chatach." So one is where you slaughtered it exactly where the animal was already cut, and one is where you slaughtered it not where it was cut. Shacha b'makom chatach, let's say you slaughtered it in the place where it's already cut. Nifsala b'shlita, that's called a disqualification act with the shlita, and therefore it's an nevela. Shelo b'makom chatach, if you didn't cut it in the place where it was cut, nifsal kidavar achar garma lipasal damya. That it's like the case where another external factor caused it to be disqualified, and so therefore it will be a treifa. So the Gemara says, "Umi amar Reish Lakish achi." Does Reish Lakish really say this? Amar Reish Lakish shachat atzakana. Does Reish Lakish really say that if you slaughter in the place where it's cut, it's going to be like a psuei shlita, and therefore it's in a vela? But we learned that if you slaughter the trachea, now the trachea is connected to the lungs. The lungs get their air from the trachea. So let's say you slaughter the trachea, and then you pierce the lungs, kshera. It's kosher. Because, why? Alma, why? Once you cut the trachea, the lungs are totally irrelevant. So it's like it's placed in a basket. Hachinami, here also, once the trachea is cut, you can't make it like a psul shchita. Once the trachea is dislodged, you can't go ahead and cut it there because it's like it's no longer there. It's in its basket. So how can you say that, how can Reish Lakish here say that if you go into a place where it's already severed and recut it, it's like a shlita and then it becomes a nevela? Elam Reb Chia bar Abba, Am Rabbi Yochanan. So we go back to this explanation. Lo kasha kan kodem chazara kan la'achar chazara u'mishnah lo zazim imkoma. That Rabbi Akiva reversed himself based upon Rabbi Yeshivav's explanation, and he said a psul shchita is in a vela. But the Mishnah Membeis, where it says that these are treifos, that was before he reversed himself. And even though Rabbi Akiva reversed himself, the Mishnah, we keep the Mishnah in its place. Mishnah lozazim imkoma. We don't change the Mishnah from its place because we retain opinions even though they were rejected by the very people who taught them, and we retain them for history. Why? Maybe it's easier to remember, or also maybe somebody else will come along and find a different explanation and support it. So Gufa, let's go back to the statement. You slaughter the trachea, and then the lungs became punctured. It's kosher because once you slaughter the trachea, you can't disqualify the animal by puncturing the lungs. So Amarava, lo Amar Reish Lakish Ela Bereya. Reish Lakish only says is that if you puncture the lungs after you cut the trachea, is it kosher? All the Chaya Tluya Bekana, because the Reya, the lungs, are totally dependent upon the trachea. But if after you do the trachea and you still haven't cut the esophagus, and then you puncture the other organs, the B'nai Me'ayim, low, then we would say the animal becomes a treifa because the other organs are not dependent upon the trachea. So Mafkis Kefla Rabbi Zera, Me'achash Anodabei Stimani Treifa, Itarta, Mali Berea, Mali B'nai Me'ayim. So Rabbi Zera challenges this. He says, if after it had a sign of a treifa, you're still going to allow it because you cut one of the simanim. What do we care where the simani treifa applies, whether it applies to the lungs or the other organs? And so obviously that's not a scientific approach because we just said there's a big difference. The difference is whether or not that organ is dependent upon the pipe that was cut. And so Rabbi Zera himself realized this. Then Rabbi Zera himself realized this. By Rabbi Zera, Niklu ben Eima'ayim ben Simon Simon Mahu. Because Rabbi Zera asked the question, if the B'nai Me'ayim became punctured after you cut one of the simanim, what will be the law? Mitzdarek Simon Rachel or Simon Sheni Latara Midei Navila. Although, would we say that you can still connect it to the second simon to with the first simon to say it's a treifa and not a nevela or not? We say it's a valid shlita and therefore it's not a nevela. The amrinon and we said lav hainu debai ilfa. Isn't this exactly the case that Ilfa talked about? Remember Ilfa from Maseches Tanis. Rabbi Yochanan started out in the same yeshiva. Rabbi Yochanan went back to the yeshiva, and Ilfa went into business because Ilfa asked, "Hotzi ubar es yado bein simul siman mahu." If the fetus stuck out his hand between the cutting of the simanim, mimitzdar siman rachel siman sheni l'tara min de nevela, do we say that the first siman will combine with the second siman to say it's no longer a carcass? For sure it can't be eaten because it would be for sure it can't be eaten under those cases because it stuck its hand out before it was slaughtered. But the question is whether or not it'll be tar from an avela. Because the first simon was okay both to l'tar midei nevela and also to eat. And the second simon was only l'tar midei nevela. And so since maybe they can't combine, therefore the limb that went out will be tummy like an avela. But for sure to eat, it's going to be disqualified. And we see from here that Rabbi Zera says that once you do one simon, we're going to say that it says just the lung is not prohibited after you slaughter it because it's like it's placed in a basket, but the other treifas are going to be prohibited. So I'm like Ravacha Ravina, no, Dilma Lolam. Maybe Rabbi Zera didn't reverse himself. Rabbi Zera Dvarav Rabbanan Kamer. Maybe he was only asking according to the Rabbanan's position, who say that it is excuse me, Rabbi Zera Dvarav the Rava Ka'amar, according to Rava's question that Rava asked, but he himself didn't agree with it. So what did Rava say earlier? He said that Reish Lakish only said it by the Reya, but by the B'nai Me'ayim it was Treifa. So according to that, he's asking if it's Tahar Midei Nevil or not. Okay, we'll continue with this piece. We'll start over this last piece again tomorrow to get it even sharper. We'll stop here, Baruch Hashem.